The cold wind was the least of her worries. Nora Parker held her daughter's body, the tiny frame still warm, but the life gone from it. The silence in the abandoned cabin was louder than any storm. Just an hour ago, 6-year-old Emily had been whispering about the cold. Now there was nothing. A single primal scream ripped from Nora's throat, a sound of such raw agony it seemed to tear the gray morning light in two. She rocked the small, still body, the tears coming in a hot, blinding rush. This couldn't be happening. Not again. Not after losing her husband. Not out here, in the unforgiving Colorado territory of 1873, with nothing to her name but a single trunk and a broken heart. 3 days later, she stood over a fresh mound of dirt on a lonely hillside. A simple wooden cross bore Emily's name. The preacher had mumbled his words, the few curious townspeople had drifted away, and now she was alone. Completely and utterly alone. The hotel owner's charity was running out. She had no money, no destination, no reason to keep breathing. As the sun bled across the mountains, casting long skeletal shadows over the graveyard, she finally turned to leave. And that's when she saw him. A tall figure, standing a respectful distance away, hat held in his hands. She'd seen him before. He was one of the men who had dug the grave. A stranger. He stepped forward, his face weathered, his eyes kind but deep, holding a sorrow she recognized. "Madam," his voice was a low rumble, gentle but firm. "My name is Russell Hayes. I own a ranch a few miles from here. I heard you might be in need of employment." Nora's grief was instantly replaced by a cold spike of suspicion. A woman alone, destitute. She knew the stories. "What sort of employment?" she asked, her voice flat and hard. "My housekeeper left a few months back. I need someone to cook, to clean." He seemed to sense her mistrust. "You'd have your own cabin, separate from the main house. I can pay you a fair wage." Nora stared at him. Why her? A complete stranger, fresh from burying her only child. "You don't know me," she said. Russell Hayes looked at the small grave, then back at her. His kind eyes held a flicker of something more than just pity. "I know loss when I see it, madam, and I know what it's like to need a new start." He paused, his gaze steady. "I can come for you with the wagon in the morning." He turned and walked away without waiting for an answer, leaving Nora standing by her daughter's grave with a choice. A terrible, impossible choice. Was this man her salvation, or had she just made a deal with the devil? The next morning, Nora packed her single trunk. Every rustle of fabric, every click of the latch echoed the emptiness in her chest. She paid the hotel owner with the last of her dignity, the man barely hiding his relief at seeing her go. Russell Hayes arrived exactly on time, his wagon sturdy, his horses well kept. He loaded her trunk without a word and helped her onto the seat, his touch brief but respectful. As they rode out of the small mining town of Silver Creek, Nora couldn't stop herself from looking back at the lonely hillside. "Could we?" she began, her voice catching. He didn't need her to finish. He turned the wagon toward the cemetery without a word. She knelt by the fresh dirt, placing Emily's favorite wooden doll at the base of the cross. "I'll come back for you," she whispered, a promise she didn't know if she could keep. When she returned to the wagon, tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks, Russell simply handed her a clean handkerchief. They rode in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic clop of hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. Then Russell broke it. "I lost my wife and son," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Typhoid, 7 years ago. My boy Thomas, he was 4. The words hung in the air between them. It wasn't an offer of comfort. It was a statement of fact, a shared language of grief. "I'm not telling you for sympathy," he continued, his voice even. Just so you know, it doesn't get better, but it gets different, more bearable." Nora looked at this quiet, stoic man and for the first time felt a flicker of something other than despair. He understood. He truly understood the gaping wound in her soul. The Hayes Ranch appeared over a rise, a sprawling property with a large two-story house, a barn, and several outbuildings. It was beautiful in a rugged, lonely way. As they pulled up, a shaggy dog bounded out to greet them, and two ranch hands, Miguel and his son Diego, emerged from the barn. They nodded at Russell, their eyes lingering on Nora with a curiosity that felt heavy. She wasn't just the new housekeeper. She was something else, an object of interest. Russell didn't take her to the main house. He led her to a small, isolated cabin about 50 yards away. "The original homestead," he explained, setting her trunk down. "It's private." The cabin was tidy, clean, but sparse. A bed, a table, a stove. One window looked out toward the distant, jagged mountains. It was a place to exist, not to live. As he left, telling her not to worry about dinner, a wave of desolation washed over Nora. She was alone, in a stranger's cabin, on a stranger's land, with nothing but the ghost of her daughter for company. She collapsed onto the bed and finally, truly broke. The sobs came from a place so deep she thought they might tear her apart. She cried until there was nothing left, falling into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. She woke to darkness and a gnawing hunger. Hesitantly, she made her way to the main house, drawn by a warm light in the windows. She knocked. The low murmur of voices inside stopped instantly. The silence was absolute. Russell opened the door, his expression unreadable. He led her to the dining room, where Miguel, Diego, and a woman named Lucia, Miguel's wife, were seated. They ate a simple stew in a tense, quiet atmosphere. After the meal, Russell showed her around the house, the kitchen, the parlor, the dusty, unused rooms upstairs. The house felt sad, neglected, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. As she was about to return to her cabin, Russell stopped her. "Mrs. Parker." His voice was low. "Thank you for coming. I know this couldn't have been easy." His simple words, his direct gaze, it was disarming. But as she walked back across the dark yard, under a sky littered with cold, indifferent stars, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This place, this man, this quiet, simmering grief. It was more than it seemed. There was a secret here. She could feel it in her bones. And she was standing right in the middle of it. The days fell into a strange, hollow routine. Nora cooked. She cleaned. She mended. The hard work was a blessing, a way to numb the constant ache in her heart. Russell was a ghost in his own home, out on the range from sunup to sundown. They shared their evening meals in near silence, two grieving souls circling each other in a house full of shadows. Nora learned to read the lines of tension in his jaw, the deep weariness in his eyes. He was carrying a burden heavier than just the loss of his family. 2 weeks into her stay, she was cleaning his study. It was a masculine room, smelling of leather and old paper. She dusted the heavy oak desk, her fingers tracing the worn grain. Her cloth snagged on a loose floorboard beneath the desk. Curious, she knelt down. Using the tip of a letter opener, she pried it up. Underneath was a small, hidden compartment. Her heart began to beat a little faster. This was wrong. She shouldn't be doing this. But she couldn't stop herself. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was feminine, delicate. It was a diary. The entries were dated 8 years prior, just before the supposed typhoid outbreak. She read a few lines, then a few pages, her blood turning to ice in her veins. This wasn't the diary of a happy wife. It was the diary of a terrified woman. A woman who believed her husband was trying to kill her. A woman named Sarah, Russell's wife. The diary spoke of his rages, of his obsession with the ranch, of a discovery she had made, something in the stream at the edge of the property, something valuable that had changed him, twisted him into a monster. The last entry was chilling. "He knows I know," it read. "Thomas and I are leaving tonight. We have to get away before he—" The entry ended there. Typhoid. Russell had said they died of typhoid. But this diary told a different story, a story of fear, of escape, of a secret worth killing for. Nora slammed the book shut, her mind reeling. She put it back, replaced the floorboard, her hands shaking so badly she could barely function. She backed out of the room, her eyes darting around, seeing the house not as a place of grief, but as a crime scene. Who was Russell Hayes? Was he a grieving widower who had offered her kindness? Or was he a monster who had murdered his own family? And what, exactly, had he hired her to do? She looked down at her hands, at the wedding band from her late husband. She was a widow, but was she working for a murderer? That night sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind sounded like footsteps approaching. Nora lay in the dark, clutching Emily's blanket, her mind racing. The diary. The words burned in her memory. Sarah Hayes hadn't died of a fever. She had been trying to flee. Flee with her son. Flee from Russell, the kind, gentle man who had offered Nora a new start. Was it all a lie? A performance? Had he seen in her a vulnerability he could exploit? The next day, she watched him as he ate the breakfast she'd prepared. She studied his hands, his face, searching for a sign of the monster from the diary. But all she saw was a quiet, sad man. It didn't make sense. Could Sarah have been hysterical? Lying? But the fear in those written words, it felt real. It felt true. Later that week, a visitor arrived. A man in an expensive suit who looked deeply out of place on the dusty ranch. Russell introduced him as Silas Thornton, a banker from Denver. The air between the two men was thick with a tension so sharp Nora could feel it from the kitchen. Thornton didn't look like a banker. He looked like a predator. His eyes, small and dark, swept over the house, the land, with a hungry, possessive glare. Lunch was a nightmare. Thornton spoke in veiled threats, his words dripping with contempt. He talked about loans, deadlines, obligations. Russell's responses were clipped, his jaw tight. Nora felt a cold dread creep up her spine. This wasn't a simple business meeting. This was a confrontation. After Thornton left, Russell stood by the window for a long time, staring out at the land Thornton's hungry eyes had just devoured. He looked trapped, defeated. That evening, Nora couldn't stop herself. As she cleared the dinner dishes, she heard Russell talking with Miguel, the ranch hand, near the barn. She crept closer, hiding in the shadows. The words she heard confirmed her fears. Mortgage, foreclosure, Thornton. The banker wasn't just collecting a debt, he was trying to take the ranch. And then she heard something that made her stop breathing. Russell, his voice low and full of rage, said, "He won't get it. I won't let him have what he killed Sarah for." Nora clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. It was true. Sarah hadn't died of typhoid. She had been killed. But Russell wasn't the killer. Thornton was. The diary suddenly made a terrifying new kind of sense. Sarah wasn't afraid of Russell. She was afraid of Thornton. And the secret she had discovered in the stream. Thornton wanted it, and he had killed her to get it. Nora stumbled back to her cabin, her world completely upended. Russell wasn't a murderer. He was a man who had lost everything to a ruthless killer, a killer who was now coming back to finish the job. And the secret that had gotten Sarah killed. It was still here, buried somewhere on this land. She was living on top of a treasure and a tomb. The next morning, Nora approached Russell with a new resolve. She found him in the study, staring at a stack of papers, the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady, "I overheard you last night, with Miguel." His head snapped up, his eyes instantly guarded, cold. "That's ranch business, Mrs. Parker." "You said Thornton killed your wife," she pressed on, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence in the room was absolute. Russell stared at her, his face a mask of stone. She had crossed a line, a dangerous line. She thought he might throw her out. Or worse. Instead, a look of utter weariness washed over his face. He sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The story came out in a torrent of grief and rage held back for 7 long years. Sarah had discovered silver in the stream. Not a lot, but enough. She'd told their partner, Silas Thornton. It was a mistake that cost her her life. Thornton, consumed by greed, had arranged an accident. A wagon crash. He made it look like she and little Thomas were trying to run away. He'd covered his tracks, paid off the right people. Russell had no proof, nothing but a father's and a husband's gut-wrenching certainty. The bank loan was Thornton's leverage, his way of finally getting his hands on the land and the silver he'd killed for. "He'll foreclose at the end of the month," Russell finished, his voice hollow. "There's nothing I can do." "Yes, there is," Nora said, a sudden fire in her voice. The grief for Emily, the fear for her own safety, it all coalesced into a single point of burning anger. This man, Thornton, would not win. "What if you could prove the silver is there?" she asked. "Use it as collateral for a new loan, from a different bank." Hope flickered in Russell's eyes for the first time. "We'd need proof, an expert, and we only have 2 weeks." Nora's mind raced. On her trips to town, she'd gotten to know the woman who ran the general store, a Mrs. Thompson. She'd mentioned her husband used to be a miner before his health failed. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. "I know someone who might be able to help," she said. For the first time, Russell looked at her not as an employee, not as a fellow mourner, but as an ally, an unexpected and perhaps dangerous partner. "All right, Mrs. Parker," he said, a new determination in his voice. "Let's fight back." As Nora left the study, Russell caught her arm. His touch was gentle, but his eyes were intense. "Thank you," he said, "for not running." In that moment, Nora realized she wasn't just fighting for this man or his ranch. She was fighting for Emily, for Sarah, for Thomas. She was fighting for every soul this empty land had swallowed. She was no longer a victim of fate. She was a woman with a purpose. And that made her more dangerous than Silas Thornton could ever imagine. The next few days were a blur of secret activity. Mr. Thompson, the retired miner, came to the ranch under the guise of buying a horse. He was old and wheezy, but his eyes lit up as he examined the stream bed. "It's here, all right," he rasped, holding up a rock with a faint, glittering vein. "Not a mother lode, but it's silver, no doubt." With Thompson's assessment written down, Russell rode to the next town, to a rival bank, a place where Thornton's influence didn't reach. Nora was left at the ranch, a bundle of nerves. She was now part of a conspiracy. She jumped at every shadow, her heart pounding every time a rider appeared in the distance. Was it Thornton? Had he found out? The ranch hands, Miguel and Diego, watched her with a quiet intensity. She realized they knew. They had known all along. They weren't just employees. They were Russell's loyal protectors, his silent army. Their presence was both a comfort and a chilling reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just about money. It was about a war that had been simmering for 7 years. Russell returned 3 days later, his face grim but with a flicker of hope in his eyes. "They're considering it," he told Nora as they sat on the porch, the setting sun casting long shadows. "The bank is sending an inspector to verify Thompson's claim. If he does, they'll give us the loan." It was a chance, a slim, dangerous chance. As they sat in the fading light, Russell reached over and took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "I couldn't have done this without you, Nora." It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it, spoken in his low, serious voice, sent a strange warmth through her. A feeling she hadn't felt in a very long time. A feeling she thought had died with her husband and been buried with her daughter. "You brought life back to this house," he said, his eyes searching hers. "Back to me." Her breath caught in her throat. The space between them crackled with unspoken emotions, a fragile connection forged in shared grief and newfound purpose. He started to lean in, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. But then he pulled back, clearing his throat. "It's getting cold," he said, letting go of her hand. The moment was gone. Nora went back to her cabin, her mind in a turmoil. She was falling for Russell Hayes. The thought was terrifying. It felt like a betrayal to Emily, to her late husband. But the feeling was undeniable. A tiny green shoot of hope, pushing its way through the barren soil of her grief. Had she come here just for a job? Or had fate, in its cruel and mysterious way, brought her here for a reason? The bank inspector, a stuffy man named Williams, arrived a few days later. He spent the entire day with Russell and Mr. Thompson down at the stream. Nora paced the house, her nerves shredded. The entire future of the ranch, of their fight against Thornton, rested on this one man's report. Finally, as evening fell, they returned to the house, muddy and tired. Russell's face was a mask, impossible to read. He and Williams disappeared into the study. Nora waited, holding her breath, for what felt like an eternity. When the study door finally opened, Williams was smiling. Russell looked like a man who had just been pulled back from the gallows. They shook hands, and as the inspector's carriage pulled away, Russell turned to Nora, a grin spreading across his face. "He's recommending the loan," he said, his voice filled with a triumphant relief that was so profound it was almost painful to witness. In that moment, all the tension, all the fear, all the carefully controlled emotions broke free. Without thinking, Nora launched herself into his arms. He stiffened for a second, surprised. Then his arms came around her, holding her tight. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of dust and leather and man. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. It was the first time she had felt truly safe since Emily had died. When she finally pulled back, her face flushed, she started to apologize. "Don't be," he said, his voice soft. He didn't let her go. His hands rested on her back, his eyes searching hers. The question he'd almost asked on the porch was there again, clear and undeniable, and this time nothing interrupted them. The world seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of them in the dim light of the hallway. The air was thick with everything they had been through, everything they had left unsaid. Her gaze dropped to his lips, and then everything changed. A shout from outside, Diego's voice, sharp with panic. "Ryder's coming! It's Thornton!" Russell's arms dropped from her. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a cold, hard fire. The brief moment of peace was shattered. The war had just arrived on their doorstep. Thornton wasn't alone. He had 4 hired guns with him, rough men with cold eyes and rifles held ready. They dismounted in the yard, a small, grim army. "Hayes," Thornton's voice was a venomous sneer. "I heard you went looking for new friends in Cedar Ridge. I'm here to tell you your loan application has been denied." Russell's face went pale. "What? How?" Thornton laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. Men like Williams have their price. It seems my offer was better than yours. The hope that had bloomed just moments before withered and died. They were trapped. It was over. Now, Thornton said, his eyes sweeping over the property with a victor's gaze, I'm the legal holder of your debt. This ranch and everything on it is now mine. You have 1 hour to pack your things and get off my land. Russell stepped forward, his body rigid with fury. You won't get away with this, Thornton. I already have, Thornton shot back. He gestured to the house. That includes your new housekeeper. Maybe I'll keep her on, for services rendered. A wave of nausea and rage washed over Nora. Russell launched himself off the porch, but Miguel and Diego grabbed him, holding him back. Violence was exactly what Thornton wanted. 1 hour, Hayes, Thornton repeated, turning his back on them. He and his men walked toward the stream, toward the silver, as if they already owned it. As soon as they were out of earshot, Russell turned to Nora, his face a mask of despair. You have to go, he said, his voice urgent. Get out of here. It's not safe. I'm not leaving you, she said, her voice shaking but firm. There's nowhere to go. This is our fight. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw a deep, heart-wrenching gratitude. But what could they do? They were outmaneuvered, outnumbered. Thornton held all the cards. As panic began to set in, Nora's mind raced back to the diary. Sarah's words. There was something else, something she'd overlooked. She ran back into the house, to the study. She ripped up the floorboard, her hands frantic, and pulled out the small leather book. She flipped through the pages, searching, her eyes scanning the delicate script. What was it? What had she missed? And then she saw it. A passage near the end. Sarah wrote about Thornton's obsession, not just with the silver, but with their father. Russell's father. There was a secret partnership, an old claim document. And something else, something about the original homestead. The small, isolated cabin where Nora was now living. Sarah had written, The proof is where it all began. Father Hayes was a clever man. He buried his heart to keep it safe. The cabin, Nora breathed. She ran outside, the diary clutched in her hand. Russell, the cabin! There's something there! Russell, Miguel, and Diego followed her, their faces a mixture of confusion and desperation. They tore into the small cabin, a place Nora had only seen as a lonely refuge. Now, it was their last hope. What did it say? Russell demanded. He buried his heart to keep it safe, Nora quoted. They looked around the small room. The bed, the table, the pot-bellied stove, and the hearth. A simple stone fireplace. The hearth, Diego said, his eyes wide. He and his father grabbed a crowbar from the porch. They pried at the stones. They were loose. Beneath them was not dirt, but a hollow space. Russell reached inside and pulled out a heavy metal box. It was rusted shut. Using the crowbar, they forced it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were documents. Old yellowed papers. One was the original deed to the ranch, signed not just by Russell's father, but by Thornton's father as well. They had been partners. But that wasn't the most important document. Beneath it was a signed confession, written in a shaky hand by Thornton's father, dated 20 years ago. A deathbed confession. He admitted to swindling the Hayes family out of their full share of a much larger silver strike nearby, using the ranch as a front. He admitted that the debt Thornton was now calling in was fraudulent, a fiction created to cover the original theft. And there was one more thing, a second ledger. This one detailed Silas Thornton's own crimes. Extortion, bribery, and a detailed entry about the payment made to the county sheriff 7 years ago to rule the deaths of Sarah and Thomas Hayes an accident. It was proof. Proof of everything. A weapon that could destroy Thornton completely. They had him. As this realization dawned, the sound of footsteps approached. Thornton and his men were coming back from the stream. Time was up. Thornton strode into the yard, a smug look on his face. "Time's up, Hayes. Get out." Russell stepped out of the cabin, the metal box in his hands. He didn't look defeated anymore. He looked dangerous. "I don't think so, Silas," he said, his voice calm and cold. He held up the confession. "I believe you know your father's handwriting." Thornton's face went from smug to shocked to pure murderous rage in a matter of seconds. The pretense was over. "Give me that box," he snarled. "You should have stayed gone," Russell said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You should have left my family alone." Thornton gave a signal. His men raised their rifles. In the same instant, Miguel and Diego emerged from the barn, each holding a shotgun. The yard was a tinderbox, a single spark away from exploding into a bloodbath. "There are 4 of us," Thornton hissed. "You can't win." "I don't need to win," Russell said, his eyes locked on Thornton. "I just need to take you with me." Nora watched from the cabin doorway, her heart in her throat. This was it, the culmination of years of pain and secrets. She saw one of Thornton's men glancing nervously toward the main house. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in her mind. While all eyes were on the standoff in the yard, she slipped out the back of the cabin. She crept along the side of the barn, her movements masked by the tense shouting. She had a plan, a terrible, reckless plan. She had seen the lanterns in the barn, the stores of kerosene. If Thornton was going to take this ranch, he would take nothing but ashes. She slipped into the barn, her hands shaking as she grabbed a lantern and a can of kerosene. She worked quickly, splashing the flammable liquid on hay bales, on wooden stalls, on the very bones of the building. She could hear the men shouting outside, the tension escalating. She lit the lantern's wick, her hand trembling. This was the point of no return. She took a deep breath and threw the lit lantern into the kerosene-soaked hay. The result was instantaneous. A whoosh of sound and a wave of heat as the barn erupted in a tower of flame. Thick, black smoke poured into the sky. "Fire!" Diego screamed. The standoff broke. Everyone's attention, for a split second, turned to the inferno. It was the distraction they needed. In that moment of chaos, Russell lunged, not at Thornton, but at the man closest to him, tackling him to the ground. Gunshots exploded. The yard descended into pure, violent chaos. Nora scrambled out the back of the burning barn, choking on the smoke. She saw Miguel go down, clutching his leg. One of Thornton's men was aiming his rifle at Russell, who was wrestling on the ground. Without thinking, Nora grabbed a heavy piece of firewood from a pile near the house. She ran, screaming, and brought the log down with all her might on the back of the gunman's head. He crumpled to the ground. The world seemed to move in slow motion. The roar of the fire, the crack of gunshots, the shouts of men. Diego fired his shotgun, taking down another of the hired guns. Russell got to his feet, the gun he'd taken from the first man in his hand. Now it was just him and Thornton. The 2 men stood facing each other in the flickering, hellish light of the burning barn. The hired hands were down, dead or wounded. It was back to where it all began, just the 2 of them. "It's over, Silas," Russell said, his voice raspy from the smoke. Thornton raised his pistol. "Not until you're dead." He fired. Nora screamed as Russell staggered back, clutching his shoulder, blood blooming on his shirt. But he didn't fall. He raised his own gun, his aim steady despite the pain. He fired once. Thornton looked down at his chest in surprise, a dark stain spreading across his expensive suit. He looked back up at Russell, his eyes wide with disbelief, and then he collapsed into the dust. He was dead before he hit the ground. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the roar and crackle of the fire. The war was over. Nora rushed to Russell's side, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against his bleeding shoulder. "Are you okay?" she cried, her voice choked with tears and smoke. "I'm alive," he gasped, wincing in pain. "You're alive." He looked at her, his eyes full of a raw, overwhelming emotion. He looked at the chaos around them, the burning barn, the bodies in the dust, the confession box lying where he'd dropped it. "You saved us," he whispered. "You crazy, brave woman. You saved us all." The aftermath was a grim, smoky blur. The fire consumed the barn, but the ranch hands, with the help of neighbors drawn by the smoke, managed to keep it from spreading to the house. The sheriff from Cedar Ridge arrived, the one not in Thornton's pocket. He took one look at the bodies, at the confession in the metal box, and knew exactly what had happened. He ruled it self-defense. The long, dark chapter of the Hayes Ranch was finally, violently closed. Miguel's leg wound was painful, but not serious. Russell's shoulder would heal. The physical scars were manageable. It was the other scars, the ones carved into their souls, that would take longer. In the days that followed, a new quiet settled over the ranch. Not the tense, grief-stricken silence of before, but a peaceful, exhausted quiet. The secrets were out. The ghosts had been faced. One evening, about a week after the fire, Nora found Russell on the porch, staring out at the blackened skeleton of the barn. His arm was in a sling, his face pale, but his eyes were clear for the first time since she'd met him. The crushing weight he'd been carrying for 7 years was gone. She came and stood beside him. They didn't speak for a long time. "I'm going to rebuild it," he said finally. "Bigger, stronger." He turned to look at her, his gaze direct and full of a feeling that made her heart ache in a good way. "Nora, I brought you here because I was desperate. I never intended for you to get caught in the middle of all this." "I'm not sorry," she said softly. "It's strange. I came here with nothing, running from a ghost. I think I needed this fight, to feel like I could do something, to feel alive again." "What are you going to do now?" he asked, his voice hesitant. The question hung in the air between them. Her job as a housekeeper was, technically, over. The pretense was gone. She was free to go. Continue on to Sacramento, to her cousin. Pick up the pieces of her old life. But the thought of leaving this place, of leaving him, felt like another kind of death. "I don't know," she answered honestly. He took her hand, the one not holding the sling, and held it tight. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a plea. "Stay here with me. This house, it's been a place of secrets and sadness for so long. You've brought light back into it. We can build something new here, together, from the ashes." He looked into her eyes, all his pain, all his hope, laid bare. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Nora Parker." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of grief for what she'd lost, but also tears of a fragile, impossible joy for what she had found. She thought of Emily, of her husband, James, and she knew they would want this for her. They would want her to live, to love, to be happy. "I think," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm falling in love with you too, Russell Hayes." He smiled, a true, brilliant smile that transformed his weary face. He leaned in and gently, tenderly, kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of wild passion, but of quiet promise, of shared sorrow and second chances, of two broken souls finding a way to be whole again, together. They stood on the porch, hand in hand as the sun went down, watching the first stars appear in the vast, purple sky. The journey had been brutal, the cost had been high, but here, in the quiet aftermath, a new life was beginning. A life she never could have imagined. A life forged in fire and loss, but one that held the promise of a future she was finally ready to embrace. Life on the ranch found a new rhythm. The rebuilding of the barn became a symbol of their new beginning. Neighbors helped, a community solidifying around the quiet rancher and the brave woman who had become his partner in every sense of the word. Nora moved out of the little cabin and into the main house. Not into Russell's room, not yet, but into a room of her own. They were taking things slowly, healing their own wounds, and learning how to build a new life together. The love between them grew not in grand gestures, but in small, everyday moments. The way he'd touch the small of her back as he passed her in the kitchen. The way she'd bring him a cup of coffee in the study late at night. They talked for hours, sharing stories of the families they had lost, keeping their memories alive, not as ghosts to be feared, but as cherished parts of who they were. The silver from the stream provided a comfortable income, enough to make the ranch prosperous, enough to ensure they would never again be at the mercy of men like Thornton. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year to the day after Nora had first arrived at the ranch, Russell took her for a ride. He led her up into the foothills, to a plateau that overlooked the entire valley. The view was breathtaking. "My father used to bring me here," he said, his arm around her as they looked down at the ranch, their home. "He told me this land wasn't something to own, but something to protect." He turned to her, his eyes serious. "Nora, this past year, you've saved me in more ways than you know. You've shown me that it's possible to live again, to love again." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He knelt down on one knee. Nora's heart stopped. Inside the box was a simple, elegant ring. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want you to have it. I want you to be my wife, to build a family with me, to fill that house with laughter again. Nora Parker, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face as she looked at this good, strong man, the man who had seen her at her lowest and had become her everything. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Russell, I'll marry you." They were married 2 months later, on a clear, cold day, with fresh snow blanketing the ground. It was a small ceremony in the main room of the ranch house, surrounded by the few, true friends who had stood by them. Nora wore a simple ivory dress, and around her neck she wore a silver locket Russell had given her. On one side was a tiny photograph of Emily, on the other, one of his son, Thomas. Their children, lost but not forgotten, were with them. As they said their vows, Nora knew she had finally found her way home, not to a place, but to a person. Years passed. The Hayes Ranch thrived. The house, once filled with shadows, now echoed with the sounds of life. The laughter of children, a boy with his father's dark hair and a girl with her mother's bright blue eyes, filled the rooms. Nora and Russell grew old together, their love a quiet, steady flame that warmed all who knew them. She never forgot Emily. There was always a part of her heart that ached for the daughter she had lost. But she had learned that a heart, even a broken one, has an infinite capacity for love. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would stand on the porch and look out at the vast, rugged land that had almost taken everything from her, but had instead given her a new life. A life of unexpected joy, of hard-won peace, and of a love so strong it had risen from the ashes. If you enjoyed this story of survival and second chances, and you want to hear more tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next.